It is now my great pleasure to recognize today's commencement speaker. Walter Issaacson became the managing editor of Time magazine in 1996, making him the 14th chief editor of the magazine since its founding in 1923. A native of New Orleans, Mr. Issaacson is a graduate of Harvard College and Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He began his journalism career as a reporter for the Sunday Times of London, and then as a reporter and City Hall columnist for the New Orleans Times-Picayune. He joined Time in 1978 as a national affairs writer in New York, and then moved to Washington as a political correspondent. In 1993, he was named editor of New Media, and he helped launch the internet service Pathfinder. In 1995, Adweek named him Editor of the Year. In his present position, Walter Issaacson oversees Time for Kids, Time Digital, and Time Daily. He still writes for the magazine, and his articles have included cover stories on Bill Gates and Madeleine Albright, as well as the essay on Time's choice of Albert Einstein as its person of the century. He is the co-author of The Wise Men, 6 Friends in the World They Made, a book about American statesmen in the Cold War, and the author of Kissinger, a biography. Please welcome Walter Issaacson.
Thank you, President Cowan, members of the graduating class, faculty, family, and friends. I feel very lucky to be here. My parents went to Tulane, most of my family went to Tulane, and I grew up in the neighborhood, learning to ride my bike on the paths of the old quad and trying to sell parking places to fans going to that great old stadium that existed before this dome was built. I made the mistake of going north to college, to the place where the weather was cold and the professors were even colder, because it was time to leave my backyard. But I think that had I been born up north, I would have experienced the warm joy of going to Tulane. So here is the first thing you should know about graduation day. Every day hence, you will appreciate more how lucky you are to have had the joy of being at such a magical place as Tulane. You are lucky in many other ways. Your commencement comes at the commencement of a new millennium. Symbolically, that's very cool. And it's more than symbolic. You're entering the real world, as President Cowan said, at a time when our nation is experiencing the greatest period of peace and prosperity, perhaps, of any country at any time in history. Don't screw it up. It's a period of fascinating opportunities. The digital revolution is transforming the flow of ideas and of art more than any revolution since the printing press paved the way for the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the rise of individual liberty. And the biotech revolution that is now dawning will allow the opportunity, for better or for worse, and that's up to you, to fiddle with our genes, to invent new organisms, to create designer babies, and someday to clone ourselves. The challenges you will face will not be technological, but moral. As I said, don't screw it up. My parents' generation graduated from Tulane during the Great Depression and World War II. That generation struggled to feed their families, then fought to save the possibility of freedom, then came home to start businesses and build homes that laid the foundation for our current economy. Not for nothing, were they called the greatest generation. My own baby boomer generation graduated from college thinking that we too would be involved in causes greater than ourselves. To some extent, the movements we were involved in, the civil rights struggle, the women's movement, even the anti-war movement, helped transform our world for the better. But we became, as most of us would now admit probably, a generation that was often complacent and self-indulgent. That's beginning to dawn on a lot of us now, sort of like the slightly nasty old joke we used to tell, which is, what did the guy at the Grateful Dead concert say when the dope wore off? The answer, this band sucks. So once again, you're lucky. As generations go, mine is not a tough one to follow. Those of you graduating today will do many things, but the one thing that will define you, or one of the many things that will define you, is that you are the third wave of the digital generation. Those in the first wave were the pioneers, like the pioneers and explorers of early American history. They were geeky hackers motivated by the thrill of a new cyberspace frontier. Those in the second wave of the digital generation were like history's gold rushers and land rushers. They were motivated more by dreams of IPO wealth, and their main purpose seems to have been getrich.com. In the wake of these gold rushers, your challenge is to be entrepreneurs with a real purpose, a purpose that is greater than a short-term business plan. It will be up to you to assure that a digital divide does not wreck both our current prosperity and our social peace by creating a two-tiered society. And that means being less complacent than my generation was about a two-tiered educational system that allows some to flourish in an information age and others to be left behind. The information age you were born into has the amazing power to spread freedom. I can remember 10, 12 years ago in 1989, I happened to be in Bratislava as the Cold War was ending. I was at a hotel where they put foreigners, and it's one of the few hotels where they allow satellite dishes to have outside TV. And the maid said, "Can we use your room so that the students can come to your room in the afternoon and watch MTV?" Because they like to see MTV, and the only place they can do it is in a tourist hotel like this. This is in the old Czechoslovakia. And I said, sure, and I came back that afternoon to see it. And there were some students there, but they weren't watching MTV. They were watching CNN and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that's when I understood the power of the information revolution to spread freedom, because I knew that the Cold War would be ending at that point because governments could not control information. And a few months ago, I was in Kashgar in Western China and saw something very similar. It's a tiny little town in Western China near the Gobi Desert, and in the back of a cafe, a coffee shop, were a few kids sitting around a computer. And I asked what they were doing, and they were on the internet. And I stepped up there and said, let me try something. And I typed in timemagazine.com, and it said blocked, access denied. I typed in CNN, it said access denied. And one of the kids pushed me aside and typed something in, and Time popped up, and then CNN popped up. I said, what'd you do? He said, oh, we know how to go through proxy servers in Hong Kong that the censors in Beijing can't figure out. And I realized, once again, the information revolution was spreading freedom. But the goal of freedom is not just individual material enrichment. It's also the nurturing of the values we share as a society. That's what distinguishes great generations, as you have the chance to be, from self-indulgent ones. And as I said, don't screw it up. Thus ends the historical perspective part of my sermon today. Now comes the one piece of advice part. That's when the commencement speaker traditionally says, if I have one piece of advice to impart, it is. Sometimes it's a grand and mushy piece of advice, like make sure you follow your dreams. Sometimes it's very specific, like in that fake Kurt Vonnegut speech where he says, always wear sunscreen. My piece of advice, one of many I could give you, but certainly you don't want to hear more than one piece of advice today, is this. Go on the road. Drive across the country. Take a raft down the river. Do it soon and do it often. Do it whenever you feel you can spare the time. And most importantly, do it whenever you're at one of those phases in your life where you feel you cannot spare the time. Go to a Rotary Club meeting where nobody knows you, or to a Main Street cafe where the shopkeepers sit and drink coffee on a slow morning. Stop at a bad roadside dive and play pool with a trucker who doesn't like the way you look. Go on a date with somebody and decide on a lark to drive across Texas. You've just spent 4 years getting an academic view of the world. You now know more at this moment than you will ever know in your life. Today you begin the process of unlearning what you thought you knew. That happens by wandering down the road. The journey of discovery, the road trip, is as old as Ulysses and Don Quixote, but it's become quintessentially American. Even though America did not invent the road as an art form, each generation of pilgrims has perfected it. From Huck Finn to Jack Kerouac, we've learned to look for adventures around the bend. And more subtly, we've learned to explore the relationship between commitment and detachment, between roots and rootlessness, between community and individualism. In college, perhaps, you learned Tocqueville, and you learned his thesis that America's sense of individualism was in deep conflict with their sense of community. On the road, you'll learn that he was wrong. The foundation of America's civic faith is that community and freedom are compatible. They are interwoven in our social fabric. Being at a national magazine like Time is like being in college. People ply you with a lot of useless theories, and every now and then you have to go on the road to unlearn the things you think you've learned. Since I've been editor, I've taken our staff on 2 road trips. The first, a couple of years ago, was driving from the Atlantic to the Pacific on Old Route 50. The second was a trip on a small boat down the Mississippi, which ended here in New Orleans just a month ago. After hearing national politicians debate and pontificate about school choice, it's useful to be at a PTA meeting in Osceola, where parents debated what a charter school would mean to a town that revolves around its Friday night high school football games. And after hearing debates on capital punishment, it's useful to visit the death chamber at Angola. As we headed across Route 50 2 years ago, we saw those who had struck out in search of new opportunities. The digital revolution allowed people to set up businesses and enterprises wherever they wanted. Old family-run shops and cafes on Main Street had given way to big box stores and chain restaurants in mega malls. But we kept noticing a yearning for a lost sense of community. For example, Irwin Miller, an 87-year-old patriarch of Cummins Engine in Indiana, who we met on the road, had turned that company from a dying Rust Belt manufacturer into a global supplier of high-tech products. He said, by using the internet, I can hold meetings on 5 continents in 5 minutes, accomplishing what used to take me 5 weeks of travel. But his main effort was revitalizing the town's touchstones of community: the library, the museum, the theater, and the abandoned Main Street. He said, we're a nation of individuals and of community people. We've got to keep remembering to keep that relationship in balance. 2 years later, as we went down the Mississippi, we saw that yearning for a restored sense of community even more. perhaps because people who live by a river, just like trees planted by a river, tend to be more rooted. The backlash against the sameness and sterility of the big Walmarts and chain stores at first took the form many years ago of what I call the rousing of America, the creation by developers such as James Rouse of quaintly entertaining renovated shopping areas like Faneuil Hall Market in Boston or Harbor Place in Baltimore, and even the old Jackson Brewery and the Riverwalk here in New Orleans. Now you can find this rousing impulse in small towns like Cairo, Illinois, or tiny hamlets like Kimmswick, Missouri. They're exposing every brick and every cobblestone in an attempt to cash in on the current prosperity with their quaint stores. Similarly, you can see a related phenomenon that could be called the Williamsburging of America. Small towns are rummaging back into their history to reassert their unique identity and their unique history. Hannibal has become a Mark Twain theme park town. In Nauvoo, Illinois, Mormons are coming back there after a century. They were expelled from there a century ago to recreate their old temple and their settlement. And even small towns like Kimmswick are recreating Civil War battles. I remember asking the guy in Kimmswick, I never knew there was a Civil War battle in Kimmswick, and he said, well, not really. It was just a skirmish involving 3 Confederates in a cave, and whatever. But what these faux Williamsburgs have in common is that they are motivated equally by a desire to have kids reconnect with history and a desire to attract tourists. The result can be a bit surreal. The quaint shopping areas sell mainly knickknacks. The history's a bit sanitized. The quest for authenticity has sometimes produced things that aren't quite authentic. But yet, it's important not to be cynical. In a rootless, road-loving America, one can sense today a sincere yearning to reestablish roots. Indeed, by the time we got near the end of the river, we were amazed by the number of people who had ventured forth and then returned home to where they felt a sense of identity. Not just yuppies, but even people, black sharecroppers who had felt the racism and fled the South, such as Alma Smith, who's now 69. She had left Vicksburg for Chicago, but is now, after a very successful career as a psychologist, one of many people coming back to Vicksburg. At that town, the greatest economic growth comes from people coming back home as retirees. At some point, she says, everybody has to come home. This yearning to return home, this yearning for community with identity and roots, is one of the most powerful things one learns from going on the road. I feel it myself here today in my home. As T.S. Eliot famously said, I think right at the end of the 4 quartets, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know that place for the first time. We all drink from wells we did not dig, and we all eat fruit from trees that were planted by people who came before us. The better we understand that, the more we'll realize that what distinguishes our generation and our time on this planet are the wells that we dig and the trees we plant for those who come after us. That's not something you're expected to know today. Don't worry. You'll learn it as you go on the road. It will begin to make sense when you first have kids. And by the time you get to the end of the road, you will understand that this is what keeps the whole journey from being meaningless. Now's the time to start on that road, to get on that road. That's why they call this a commencement. Godspeed.
Walter, thank you for that very inspiring talk and that wonderful advice, especially going on the road and don't screw it up. The President's Medal is awarded to those individuals who have not only distinguished themselves by their accomplishments, but who have proven themselves to be a special friend of Tulane University and New Orleans. The medal was established in 1999, and the first recipient was Cokie Roberts. On this happy occasion, it is my pleasure to present the President's Medal to Walter Issaacson. Walter, please come forward.